My name is John M. Samuels, and I am what is referred to as a restoration engineer and producer. And my primary function is to transfer recordings to make them sound as good as possible. These are recordings made between roughly 1900 and about 1980, so they can be put in another digital format, in this case a CD perhaps, or some form of video, or some sort of download. When I talk about playing a disc and when I talk about recording a disc, you have to go from what's called analog to digital. And so you take the analog playback of a disc and we record it into what we call the digital domain. Now this goes through a device called an analog to digital converter, and it converts all these sound signals into zeros and ones. They then create sound files which can then be preserved by a library, and fortunately for future generations can be copied forever. When the Rodgers and Hammerstein Sound Archive does a transfer, they have theoretically two audiences in mind. One audience is the individual listener, meaning somebody who would come in today and listen to it. But you also have to recognize that we're trying to preserve these things for future generations, and that's not entirely the same thing. The Rodgers and Hammerstein Archive basically tries to give you the best of both worlds. It does minimal intervention on the recording itself by choosing the proper way to play it back based on the best knowledge, both in terms of research and in terms of the experts that R&H uses. And then it tries to put recordings together in a coherent way and occasionally remove some degree of noise. When reproducing vintage recordings, such as 78s, LPs, cylinders, wire recordings, tape recordings, there's always the question of what's the best playback device. But generally speaking, when possible, archives and transfer engineers who do things for external clients tend to use modern equipment. The reason is that usually the devices that play back the older devices that play back these things handle them much more roughly, but also because very often the recording technology of the devices at the time was greater than the playback technology. So we have, with modern equipment, the ability to do things that our predecessors couldn't do. There are many formats that a sound archive has to preserve. One of the most common and most important is what is sometimes referred to as open reel tape, other times as reel-to-reel tape. One thing people don't know is that prior to roughly 1947, and in many cases 1949, every recording is really live. Because basically you recorded, you started, you stopped, and even 78 recordings that might be recorded in sections were actually recorded in those sections. And reel-to-reel tape became the ubiquitous format. Discs were used into the 1970s, but most radio stations and most individuals had jettisoned them by the mid-1950s. Now, record companies realized that you didn't have to record only one way. You could record at different speeds. You could also record in different formats. And the Rodgers and Hammerstein Sound Archive has various devices and machines to play back the individual tapes that they possess so they can be translated into a digital format that you can listen to today. Why do you preserve history? The reason you preserve history is because it isn't dead, it's always living. It's there for you to be able to live in the moment to the degree that you can, and perhaps learn something more about yourself and learn more about society. Why preserve? Because it's necessary, because it's worthwhile, and because it's autura Tuscanini.
The gypsy fires are burning, the kettle sings a song, and good folks want their lining that are empty all day long. Then welcome if you've lost your way, for daylight past and gone, and strangers might do worse than stay and house with gypsies.